Hello, this is English 9A, Credit 1, Lesson 2. We're going to start the reading for this packet. If you go to page 14, this is your annotation guidelines. So as you are reading the story, you are going to be taking notes or annotations in the margin. So where these blue squiggly lines are, those are your margins and those are where you will be taking your notes. So look at this guideline to learn how to annotate throughout the story. This is worth 20 points of your packet, so please make sure you do it and get the points for it. You can also use these to look at when you're doing your mastery check, so it's really good to take really good notes so that you have something to reference back to when you do get to that mastery check portion. So the story we're going to read is "And of the Clay We Are Created." If you look at the bottom of this page, they annotated the first paragraph for you. So this is kind of like an example for you. Obviously, you can add more to it if you see something in there that you want to know about. But this is a good example what we will be grading this on, okay? So first we're going to read about the author. So on November 13th, 1985, the long dormant Nevado del Ruiz volcano erupted in Colombia, South America. Molten rock and hot gases melted the volcano's thick ice cap and sent deadly mudslides down its slopes. More than 23,000 people died in the disaster, most of them in the town of Armero. The media focused a lot of attention on one 13-year-old girl named Amira Sanchez who was trapped in the mud. Isabel Allende used these facts as the basis for this work of fiction. In her story, the trapped girl is named Azucena, and the man who attempts to rescue her is a journalist, Rolf Karl. So, we are going to start the story. There are questions throughout the story, so I'll stop so you can answer those questions and go over them with you. So, "And of the Clay We Are Created," short story by Isabel Allende. They discovered the girl's head protruding from the mud pit, eyes wide, open, calling soundlessly. She had a first communion name, Azucena Lily. In the vast cemetery where the odor of death was already attracting vultures from far away, and where the weeping of orphans and wails of injured filled the air, a little girl obstinately clinging to life became the symbol of the tragedy. The television cameras transmitted so often the unbearable images of the head budding like a black squash from the clay that there was no one who did not recognize her and know her name. And every time we saw her on the screen, right behind Rolf Karl, who had gone there on assignment, never suspecting that he would find a fragment of his past lost 30 years before. So, if you go to the next page, the first question is, make an inference or a guess. What is Rolf's profession? Explain your reasoning. I did mention this in the beginning when I was reading the portion of the author. So go ahead and answer to that question. So you can start it off as Rolf's profession might be, and then explain whatever you think he might be. And when you're ready, we can move on. First, the subterranean sob rocked the cotton fields, curling them like waves of foam. Geologists had set up their seismographs weeks before and knew the mountain had awakened again. For some time, they had predicted that the heat of the eruption could detach the eternal ice from the slopes of the volcano, but no one heeded their warnings. They sounded like the tales of frightened old women. The towns in the valley went about their daily life, deaf to the moaning of the earth, until that fateful Wednesday night in November, when a prolonged roar announced the end of the world, and walls of snow broke loose, rolling in an avalanche of clay, stones, and water that descended on the villages and buried them beneath the unfathomable meters of telluric vomit. As soon as the survivors emerged from the paralysis of that first awful terror, they could see that houses, plazas, churches, white cotton plantations, dark coffee forests, cattle pastures, all had disappeared. Much later, after soldiers and volunteers had arrived to rescue the living and trying to assess the magnitude of the catalysm, it was calculated that beneath the mud lay more than 20,000 human beings and an indefinite number of animals petrifying in the vicious soup. Forests and rivers had also been swept away, and there was nothing to be seen but an immense desert of mire. When the station called before dawn, Rolf, Carl, and I were together. I crawled out of bed, dazed with sleep, and went to prepare coffee while he hurriedly dressed. He stuffed his gear in the green canvas backpack he always carried, and we said goodbye, as we had so many times before. I had no presentiments. I sat in the kitchen sipping my coffee and planning the long hours without him, sure that he would be back the next day. He was one of the first to reach the scene, because while other reporters were fighting their way to the edges of the morass in jeeps, bicycles, or on foot, each getting there however he could, Rolf Karl had the advantage of a television helicopter, which flew him over the avalanche. We watched on our screens the footage captured by his assistant's camera, in which he was up to his knees in muck, a microphone in his hand, in the midst of a bedlam of lost children, wounded survivors, corpses, and devastation. The story came to us in his calm voice. For years he had been a familiar figure in the newscasts, reporting live at the scene of battles and catastrophes with awesome tenacity. Nothing could stop him, and I was always amazed at his equanimity in the face of danger and suffering. It seemed as if nothing could shake his fortitude or deter his curiosity. Fear seemed to never touch him, although he had confessed to me that he was not a courageous man, far from it. I believe that the lens of the camera had a strange effect on him. It was as if it transported him to a different time from which he could watch events without actually participating in them. When I knew him better, I came to realize that this fictive distance seemed to protect him from his own emotions. So in question 2, you're going to reread lines 31 through 54 and summarize what you know about the relationship between the narrator and Carl. So if you're looking at 31 to 54, so basically this a couple paragraphs right here, you're going to answer the question, who is the narrator, and what is the relationship with Rolf Karl? So go ahead and answer that, and then we'll move on. Rolf Karl was in on the story of Azucena from the beginning. He filmed the volunteers who discovered her, and the first person who tried to reach her. His camera zoomed in on the girl, her dark face, her large, desolate eyes, the plastered down tangle of her hair. The mud was like quicksand around her, and anyone attempting to reach her was in danger of sinking. They threw a rope to her that she made no effort to grasp until they shouted to her to catch it. Then she pulled a hand from the mire and tried to move, but immediately sank a little deeper. Rolf threw down his knapsack and the rest of his equipment and waded around the quagmire, commenting for his assistant's microphone that it was cold and that one could begin to smell the stench of corpses. "What's your name?" he asked the girl, and she told him her flower name. "Don't move, Azucena," Rolf Karl directed, and kept talking to her without thought for what he was saying, just to distract her, while slowly he worked his way forward up in the mud to his waist. The air around him seemed as murky as the mud. It was impossible to reach her from the approach he was attempting, so he retreated and circled around where there seemed to be a firmer footing. When finally he was close enough, he took the rope and tied it beneath her arms so they could pull her out. He smiled at her with that smile that crinkles his eyes and makes him look like a little boy. He told her that everything was fine, that he was here with her now, that soon they would have her out. He signaled to others to pull, but as soon as the cord tensed, the girl screamed. They tried again, and her shoulders and arms appeared, but they could move her no farther. She was trapped. Someone suggested that her legs might be caught in the collapsed walls of her house, but she said it was not just rubble, that she was also held by the bodies of her brothers and sisters clinging to her legs. What clues in lines 71 through 82 do you see to reveal how Carl feels as he attempts to rescue Azucena? Give examples of descriptive language the author uses. So we're looking at this paragraph, okay, revealing how Carl feels as he attempts to rescue her. So what language does he use, and what descriptive language? And descriptive language is appealing to your senses. So go ahead, and if you were taking notes, you can look at those, and those should be able to help you answer number 3. Don't worry, we'll get you out of here, Rolf promised. Despite the quality of the transmission, I could hear his voice break, and I loved him more than ever. Azucena looked at him, but said nothing. During those first hours, Rolf Karl exhausted all resources of his ingenuity to rescue her. He struggled with poles and ropes, but every tug was an intolerable torture for the imprisoned girl. It occurred to him to use one of the poles as a lever, but got no result and had to abandon that idea. He talked a couple soldiers into working with him for a while, but they had to leave because so many other victims were calling for help. The girl could not move, she barely could breathe, but she did not seem desperate, as if an ancestral resignation allowed her to accept her fate. The reporter, on the other hand, was determined to snatch her from her death. Someone brought him a tire, which he placed beneath her arms like a life buoy, and then laid a plank near the hole to hold his weight and allow him to stay closer to her. As it was impossible to remove the rubble blindly, he tried once or twice to dive toward her feet, but emerged frustrated, covered with mud and spitting gravel. He concluded that he would have to have a pump to drain the water, and radioed a request for one, but received in return a message that there was no available transport and it could not be sent until the next morning. Number 4. What actions does Carl undertake to rescue Azucena? Review the last section of the plot and list at least 3 examples. So one of the examples is he used one of the poles as a lever. So Rolf used one of the poles as a lever, and then go through and pick 2 more examples, and then you can move on. So this is a picture of Colombia after the eruption of the volcano. We can't wait that long, Rolf shouted, but in the pandemonium no one stopped to commiserate. Many more hours would go by before he accepted that he had stagnated and reality had been irreparably distorted. A military doctor came to examine the girl and observed that her heart was functioning well, and that if she did not get too close, she could survive the night. Hang on, Azucena. We'll have the pump tomorrow, Rolf tried to console her. Don't leave me alone, she begged. No, of course, I won't leave you. Someone brought him coffee, and he helped the girl drink it, sip by sip. The warm liquid revived her, and she began telling him about her small life, about her family and her school, about how things were in that little bit of world before the volcano erupted. She was 13, and she had never been outside her village. Rolf Karl, buoyed by premature optimism, was convinced that everything would end. Well, the pump would arrive, they would drain the water, move the rubble, and Azucena would be transported by helicopter to a hospital where she would recover rapidly and where he could visit her and bring her gifts. He thought, she's already too old for dolls, and I don't know what would please her. Maybe a dress. I don't know much about women, he concluded, amused, reflecting that although he had known many women in his lifetime, none had taught him these details. To pass the hours, he began to tell Azucena about his travels and adventures as a news hound, and when he exhausted his memory, he called upon imagination, inventing things he thought might entertain her. From time to time she dozed, but he kept talking in darkness to assure her that he was still there and to overcome the menace of uncertainty. That was a long night. Review the previous paragraph. What did you learn about Rolf's character in these lines? So this answer should be a couple of sentences, so make sure you go back and pull things from the story to answer that question. Many miles away, I watched Rolf Karl and the girl on a television screen. I could not bear the wait at home, so I went to the national television, where I often spent entire nights with Rolf editing programs. There I was near his world, and I could at least get a feeling of what he lived through during those 3 decisive days. I called all the important people in the city, senators, commanders of the armed forces, the North American ambassador, and the president of the Natural Petroleum, begging them for a pump to remove the slip, but obtained only vague promises. I began to ask for urgent help on radio and television to see if there wasn't someone who could help us. Between calls, I would run to the newsroom to monitor the satellite transmissions that periodically brought new details of the catastrophe. While reporters selected scenes with most impact for the news report, I searched for footage that featured Azucena's mud pit. The screen reduced the disaster to a single plane and accentuated the tremendous distance that separated me from Rolf Karl nonetheless. I was there with him. The child's every stuttering hurt me as it did him. I felt his frustration, his impotence. Faced with the impossibility of communicating with him, the fantastic idea came to me that if I tried, I could reach him by force of mind, and that way give him encouragement. I concentrated until I was dizzy and frenzied in futile activity. At times I would be overcome with compassion and burst out crying at other times. I was so drained, I felt as if I were staring through the telescope at the light of a star dread for 1,000,000 years. Number 6. How does the narrator try to feel close to Rolf? Cite textual evidence from 130 to 152. So on this page, there's a couple things she does. So go ahead. Again, you're going to cite the evidence. So you need to pull this from the reading, a quote, okay? I watched the hell on the first morning broadcast. Cadavers of people and animals awash in the current of new rivers formed overnight from the melted snow. Above the mud rose the tops of trees and bell towers of a church where several people had taken refuge and were patiently awaiting rescue teams. Hundreds of soldiers and volunteers from the civil defense were clawing through the rubble searching for survivors, while long rows of ragged specters awaited their turn for a cup of hot broth. Radio networks announced that their phones were jammed with calls from families offering shelter to orphaned children. Drinking water was in scarce supply along with gasoline and food. Doctors resigned to amputating arms and legs without anesthesia pled that they at least they be sent serum and painkillers and antibiotics. Most of the roads, however, were impassable, and worse were the bureaucratic obstacles that stood in the way. To top it all, the clay contaminated by decomposing bodies threatened the living with an outbreak of epidemics. Azucena was shivering inside the tire that held her above the surface. Immobility and tension had greatly weakened her, but she was conscious and could still be heard when a microphone was held out to her. Her tone was humble, as if apologizing for all the fuss. Rolf Karl had a growth of beard and dark circles beneath his eyes. He looked near exhaustion. Even from that enormous distance, I could sense the quality of his weariness, so different from the fatigue of other adventures. He had completely forgotten the camera. He could not look at the girl through a lens any longer. The pictures we were receiving were not his assistants, but those of other reporters who had appropriated Azucena, bestowing on her the pathetic responsibility of embodying the horror of what happened in that place. With first light, Rolf tried again to dislodge the obstacles that held. And so I'm gonna pause there. Number 7, what does the narrator mean when he says Rolf had completely forgotten the camera? Go ahead and answer that question. So I'm going to start at that sentence again. With the first light, Rolf tried again to dislodge the obstacles that held the girl in her tomb, but he had only hands to work with. He did not dare use a tool for fear of injuring her. He fed Azucena a cup of cornmeal mush and bananas the army was distributing, but she immediately vomited it up. The doctor stated that she had a fever and added there was little he could do. Antibiotics were being reserved for cases of gangrene. A priest also passed by and blessed her, hanging a medal of Virgin around her neck. By evening, a gentle, persistent drizzle began to fall. The sky is weeping, Azucena murmured as she, too, began to cry. Don't be afraid, Rolf begged. You have to keep your strength up and be calm. Everything will be fine. I'm with you, and I'll get you out somehow. Reporters returned to photograph Azucena, as her the same questions, which she has no longer tried to answer. In the meanwhile, more television and movie teams arrived with spools of cable, tapes, film, videos, precision lenses, recorders, sound consoles, lights, reflecting screens, auxiliary motors, cartons of supplies, electricians, sound of technicians, and cameramen. Azucena's face was beamed to millions of screens around the world. The picture above is them searching for survivors in Colombia. And all the while, Rolf Karl kept pleading for a pump. The improved technical facilities bore results, and the national television began receiving sharper pictures and clearer sound. The distance seemed suddenly compressed, and I had the horrible sensation that Azucena and Rolf were by my side, separated from me by impenetrable glass. I was able to follow events hour by hour. I knew everything my love did to wrest the girl from her prison and help her endure her suffering. I overheard fragments of what they said to one another and can guess the rest. I was present when she taught Rolf to pray and when he distracted her with stories I had told him 1,001 nights beneath the white mosquito netting of our bed. In line 200, why does the narrator experience a horrible sensation when she sees Azucena and Rolf on the TV screen? So that's right here. And those couple sentences. When darkness came on the second day, Rolf tried to sing Azucena to sleep with old Australian folk songs he had heard from his mother, but she was far beyond sleep. They spent most of the night talking each other in a stupor of exhaustion and hunger and shaking with cold. That night, imperceptibly, and unyielding floodgates that had contained Rolf Karl's past for so many years began to open, and a torrent of all had lain hidden in the deepest and most secret layers of a memory poured out, leveling before it the obstacles that had blocked his consciousness for so long. He could not tell it all to Azucena. She perhaps did not know there was a world beyond the sea or time previous to her own. She was not capable of imagining Europe in the years of war. So he could not tell her defeat, nor the afternoon the Russians had led them to the concentration camp to bury prisoners dead from starvation. Why should he describe to her how the naked bodies piled like a mountain of firewood resembled fragile china? How could he tell this dying child about ovens and gallows? Nor did he mention the night he had seen his mother naked, shod in stiletto-heeled red boots, sobbing with humiliation. There was much he did not tell, but in those hours he relived for the first time all things his mind had tried to erase. Azucena had surrendered her fear to him, and so, without wishing it, had obliged Rolf to confront his own. There, beside the hellhole of mud, it was impossible for Rolf to flee from himself any longer, and the visceral terror he had lived as a boy suddenly invaded him. He reverted to years when he was the age of Azucena and younger, and like her, found himself trapped in a pit without escape, buried alive, his head barely above ground. He saw before his eyes the boots and legs of his father, who had removed his belt and was whipping it in the air with the never-forgotten hiss of a viper coiled to strike. Sorrow flooded through him, intact and precise as if it had lain always on his mind waiting. He was once again in the armor where his father locked him to punish him for imagined misbehavior, there where for eternal hours he had crouched with his eyes closed, not to see darkness, with his hands over his ears to shut out the beating of his heart, trembling, hurtled like a cornered animal, wandering in the midst of his memories. He found his sister, Katerina, a sweet, retarded child who spent her life hiding with hope that her father would forget the disgrace of her having been born. So we're going to go back up to number 9. Line 227 mentions how Azucena forces Rolf to confront his own fear. Based on this, what can you infer is Rolf's fear? And then number 10, how does her predicament or problem force Rolf to face his fear? With Katharina, Rolf crawled beneath the dining room table, and with her hid there, under the long white tablecloth, 2 children forever embraced, alert to footsteps and voices. Katerina's scent melded with his own sweat, with aromas of cooking, garlic, soup, freshly baked bread, and the unexpected odor of putrescent clay. His sister's hand in his, her frightened breathing, her silk hair against his cheek, and the candid glaze of her eyes, Katerina materialized before him, floating on the air like a flag, clothed in the white tablecloth, now a winding sheet, and at last he could weep for her death and for the guilt of having abandoned her. He understood that all his exploits as a reporter, the feats he had won him such recognition and fame, were merely an attempt to keep his most ancient fears at bay, and a stratagem for taking refuge behind a lens to test whether reality was more tolerable than perspective. He took excessive risk as an exercise of courage, training day by day to conquer the monsters that tormented him by night. But he had to come face to face with the moment of truth. He could not continue to escape his past. He was Azucena. He was buried in the clay mud. His terror was not the distant emotion of almost forgotten childhood. It was a claw sunk in his throat. In the flush of his tears, he saw his mother dressed in black and clutching her imitation crocodile pocketbook to her bosom, just as he had last seen her on the dock when she had come to put him on the boat to South America. I'm going to go back up to question 11. In lines 250 to 254, what is the conclusion Rolf reaches with overcoming his fear and choosing to become a reporter? She had not come to dry his tears, but to tell him to pick up a shovel. The war was over, and now they must bury the dead. Don't cry, I don't hurt anymore, I'm fine, Azucena said when dawn came. I'm not crying for you, Rolf smiled. I'm crying for myself. I'm hurt all over. The 3rd day in the Valley of Catalysm began with a pale light filtering through storm clouds. The President of the Republic visited the area in his tailored safari jacket to confirm that this was the worst catastrophe of the century. The country was in mourning. Sister nations have offered aid. He had ordered a state of siege. The armed forces would be merciless. Anyone caught stealing or committing other offenses would be shot on sight. He added that it was impossible to remove all the corpses or count the thousands who had disappeared. The entire valley would be declared holy ground, and bishops would come to celebrate solemn mass for the souls of the victims. He went to the army-filled tents to offer relief in the form of vague promises to the crowds of rescued, then to improvised hospitals to offer a word of encouragement to doctors and nurses worn down from so many horrible tribulations. That picture is a picture of the town in which the volcano flooded. Then he asked to be taken to see Azucena, the little girl who the whole world had seen. He waved to her with a limp statesman hand, and microphones recorded his emotional voice and paternal tone as he told her that her courage had served as an example to the nation. Rolf Karl interrupted to ask for a pump, and the president assured him that he personally would attend to the matter. I caught a glimpse of Rolf for a few seconds kneeling beside the mud pit. On the evening news broadcast, he was still in the same position, and I, glued to the screen like a fortune teller to her crystal ball, could tell that something fundamental had changed in him. I knew somehow during the night his defenses had crumbled and he had given in to grief. Finally, he was vulnerable. The girl had touched a part of him that he himself had no access to, a part that he had never shared with me. Rolf wanted to console her, but it was Azucena who had given him consolation. So number 12 was infer how the narrator feels about the president's visit. Use specific textual examples of descriptive language. So again, the senses, your hearing, your sight, all of those, okay? I recognize the precise moment at which Rolf gave up the fight and surrendered the torture watching the girl die. It was with him 3 days and 2 nights spying on them from the other side of life. I was there when she told him that in all her 13 years no boy had ever loved her and that it was a pity to leave this world without knowing love. Rolf assured her that he loved her more than he could ever love anyone, more than he loved his mother, more than his sister, more than all the women who had slept in his arms, more than he loved me, his life companion, who would have given anything to be trapped in that well in her place, who would have exchanged her life for Azucena's, and I watched as he leaned down to kiss her poor forehead, consumed by sweet, sad emotion he could not name. I felt how in that instant both were saved from despair, how they were freed from the clay, how those rose above the vultures and the helicopters, how together they flew above the vast swamp of corruption and laments, how finally they were able to accept death. Rolf Karl prayed in silence that she would die quickly because such pain cannot be borne. By then I had obtained a pump in which I was in touch with a general who agreed to ship it the next morning on a military cargo plane. But on the night of that third day, beneath the unblinking focus of quartz lamps and the lenses of hundreds of cameras, Azucena gave up, her eyes locked with those of a friend who had sustained her to the end. Rolf Karl removed the life buoy, closed her eyelids, held her to his chest for a few moments, and let her go. She sank slowly, a flower in the mud. You are back with me, but you are not the same man. I often accompany you to the station, and we watch the videos of Azucena again. You study them intently, looking for something you could have done to save her, something you did not think of in time. Or maybe you study them to see yourself in a mirror, naked. Your cameras lie forgotten in a closet. You do not write or sing. You sit out long hours before the window, staring at the mountains. Beside you, I wait for you to complete the voyage into yourself, for the old wounds to heal. I know that when you return from your nightmares, we shall again walk in the hand in hand as before. So number 13, the narrator says Rolf Karl is no longer the man he used to be. In your own words, how has he changed? So this is really important. This is going to be part of your performance task. So make sure you go through the story and you, in your own words, explain how he changed throughout the story. And then number 14, what do you think is the theme or the main idea, moral or lesson of the story? What point about life was the author trying to make? And use textual evidence to support your response. So tell me what your theme is, what you think the theme is, and what point the author was trying to make, and then give me examples. So textual evidence is a quote from the story, okay? And if you're looking at page 32, this is just for me to grade. So this is what I'm grading you based off of your notes. So please make sure you are taking notes, and that